So it's going to be a little bit different getting your folder set up, but I think most people at this point, you should know how to set up a folder. So let's set up a folder for today. And then we'll name it 1/27/2020. Open up brackets. And then we'll go ahead and, once brackets is open, set your folder to that directory you just created, to that folder you just created. The reason being is because it makes life a lot easier if you do that. So I'm going to go to, I have mine on my desktop, but I imagine most people probably have it on a flash drive or documents or something like that. Okay, and then choose today's folder. Select. Now everything we create will be inside that folder. Makes organizing things a lot easier. One of the biggest problems I typically see is people just losing files. Like you start a file somewhere and then you have like a second copy in your downloads for some reason, another copy in your documents, and then you go to turn stuff in, you don't know which version you actually have. So this keeps you organized. Seems like a relatively simple thing, but you'd be surprised how many people I see struggling, mostly because of their organization. Like they might be kind of half okay on the material, but their files are just poorly organized, so they can't ever find anything, and so they spend most of their time doing that instead of actually writing code. So you can see we have an assignment out there. This is going to be due in 1 week. We'll have time at the end of class to work on it. And again, from my experience, like there's no official attendance. You only have to do that the first day. But the people who don't stick around to do the assignments are typically the people that don't pass. Okay. I don't know how many times I can reiterate that, but I know it's very tempting. You're like, oh, he doesn't take attendance anyway, just to get up and walk out. Don't do that because you're not doing yourself any favor. Okay, there's enough time that most people in here should be able to finish this, so we don't even have to worry about this next week. This next week due date is more like you worked on this all class and you still can't quite get it, or for the people who aren't here in class today. But I would set like a personal due date of having this done by the end of class. Everyone good with that? A lot of this isn't going to make a lot of sense just yet, so let's not worry about the assignment just yet. Just know that this is what we're going to be working on at the end of class. Got brackets all set up. We're going to get through probably about 8 examples today, so we have kind of a lot of material to get through. So let's go ahead and get started. So any questions on any administrative stuff before we get going here? Okay, so no docked frames. I think we're in here. So just to be super clear, everyone's got their folder created. You've got brackets open. You're actually going to follow along with the code and not just watch up here and be like, I get this stuff. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. File, new. That gives us a little work area, but nothing saved just yet. So let's start off with HTML shell. So that should be under resources. Let's get ourselves just a basic page here. So syntax highlighting isn't enabled right now. It's not working. What do I need to do? What's my first step after pasting this in? Save it. Perfect. So I'm going to use a lot of keyboard shortcuts, and so you'll see sometimes just like random screens pop up, but it's just a good habit to get used to them. So on my PC it's Control-S, but I'm pretty sure on Mac it's Command-S. Yes. So as soon as I hit that, just get used to these shortcuts. Some of these shortcuts you use them so often. There's probably less than 10 of them. Realistically, and it'll make your life a lot faster. So saving, cut, paste, copy, select all, undo. It's a pretty small number of them. Okay, but you can see here it defaulted to this folder, so we're going to just call this ex1.html. The .html part is very important because that's how it knows it's actually an HTML file. And now it knows it's an HTML file, so we have syntax hiding. So it's been a couple weeks. Let's just start off with the basic stuff. We'll go through it kind of fast. So if you remember, we talked about H1s through H5s. Yeah, we'll say first level. And then, oh yeah, don't forget to have this beautify enabled. Notice that when I saved it, it did indentation for me. Now this isn't going to be perfect. If you have like really terrible indentation, it's not going to know what to do with it. But if it's just off a little bit, it usually does a pretty decent job. Okay, so just if anybody forgot, under extensions, BEAUTIF. You can see for me it's already installed, but I would suggest installing that for everyone else. I'm going kind of quick because we went over this stuff last week. If any of this is like completely new, go over last week's lecture. And then under edit, I enabled beautify and save, and that's every time I do my Control S, if I have some code that's off a little bit as far as indentation goes, it takes care of it for us. So what website uses H1s through H5s like constantly? A lot of web pages don't use it that often. They might use an H1 for the title of their page and that's it. What site has them everywhere that we talked about a couple weeks ago? What's that? Wikipedia, perfect, okay. So think of that in your head. Now, this is just kind of like a table of contents it generates, but just to be clear, sometimes I'm not super clear about this, and I guess it can be confusing. The H1, so this would be an H1, H2, H2. Wikipedia has a nice little feature where it actually, based on those, it can actually generate a table of contents. But the H1s through H5s are actually going here. I think most people saw that, but just to be clear, okay. And you can see some H3s and so on. Okay. We also had paragraphs. And then don't forget that Brackets has a built-in web server that we can just click this and view our page. Mine's zoomed in, so it's going to, for obvious reasons, but you get the idea. Now these are all what are known as block level tags. By the way, most browsers have some sort of similar feature. I happen to know the Chrome and Firefox developer tools best, but I'm pretty sure Safari has something similar. But you can see here, I know you don't need to see this particular source, but you can kind of see what's happening here as I hover over it. It tells me what's going on here. It tells me where the border and the padding and the margin and all that stuff are, okay? So this is kind of a useful feature. But H1, H2, H3, paragraph, these are what are known as block level tags. So what's a block level tag? The best way to explain it is by showing, and that isn't one that's inline. So let me ask you, after, without even running it, after the word another, is that going to drop down to the next line, or is it going to be on the same line? Same line. So what do you think a block level tag does? It drops it down to a new line. See what happened here? H1, after it's done with the H1, it dropped down. So then we'll go back here. But notice that the word another, this is inline. It stays on, it's like inline, it stays on the same thing. Okay. Most of the tags that we're dealing with are going to be block level, but there's a few that are inline. EM, strong, there's probably others. Span. Now, we don't tend to use the words like this is a paragraph. What do we use instead? Or Ipsum, perfect. I think I've got a link in Blackboard, but it's one of those things that are easy enough to Google. Let me take a side note here, just because I got this question in a first semester class, and sometimes you get like these things may not be super obvious. So first of all, does it make sense for every sentence to be wrapped in the paragraph tag? No. That one's usually pretty obvious, because what's going to happen to every single sentence? It's going to be on its own line. One that may not be so obvious just shrink this a little bit here. What do you think the problem with this is? I've essentially got two paragraphs wrapped in a single paragraph tag. Okay. I realize sometimes these questions, it seems like so obvious that you're like, yeah, of course. But the reason I bring these things up is because I've seen students in other classes have these questions. That's why I bring them up. Okay. So each paragraph gets its own paragraph tag. What happens if I wanted another paragraph? What would I do? Yeah, just make a new paragraph tag. And then put that other one here, okay? But we'll stick to, for purposes of room, let's just do that, okay? I think that's about all I want to do with that example. So any questions on this? I mean, this should be kind of like pretty basic stuff at this point. That's why I'm going through it kind of fast. Yeah?
So can you just, I mean, this could be totally wrong, but can you just have, like, say you had 3 paragraphs in one paragraph tag, but can you use a line break?
Yes, but it's not really so the idea is that you want to describe what the content is.
Okay.
And you're right, visually it would look the same, but it wouldn't be describing the content.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Okay, so let's do file new. And then let's do another HTML shell here. I'm going to save this as ex2.html. And then let's explore kind of an interesting tag here. I think W3 Schools has like a listing of all. I'll just Google it. Yeah, so they've got an HTML reference that has pretty much everything. So let's explore some of these. Header. Header seems interesting. Let's go ahead and explore header. Now, a lot of this is vague because header on a news site might be different than a header on, say, IRSC or a header on Pizza Hut's website. Does it make sense? Header just vaguely means, you know, that it's a header. It's sort of up to you to decide what a header means. Most people can kind of agree on a vague definition of a header, but maybe I just want it to be the title of my site or something like that, okay? But we'll be kind of generic, just write my header. Same thing with a footer. Maybe on a footer you might want to put the copyright. So go ahead and save it and then preview it in the browser. And then let me ask you a question. Do you think header and footer are block level tags? Yes or no? Who says yes? Show hands. Who says no? Okay. So does anybody say yes? So what's the obvious giveaway for a block level tag? What happens at the end of the line? We get a new line. So after my header, did we get a new line? And it's kind of difficult to tell with footer, but just kind of from basic logic, header and footer are kind of the same. So now let me ask you again, who thinks that header and footer are block level tags? Show of hands. Okay. So always keep that in mind because these block level tags become important when we get into something called the box model. But another tag I want to explore here, it's called article. Article is interesting. It's very vague because, again, depending on your context, so it could be, actually W3 Schools has a decent little page on article. So it could mean a lot of things. It could be a forum post, blog post, an actual real article on a news site. It could be a comment. If you're running a recipe site, it could be a recipe. Okay, it's very generic, and usually you know by the context. Okay. Now you wouldn't put article in something like your site's navigation. That wouldn't typically make sense. Usually it's pretty obvious. Usually it's if I had to grab a random page here. Something with a lot of text. See admissions. You think it wouldn't be so difficult to find a good example? Give me 1 second. Perfect. So this content here, like this might be an article. Usually it's somewhat obvious based on your context. Okay. And we can see here from W3 Schools, how do you use it? Typically what most people do is they have an H1 and that'll be the title of the article. So let's make up an H1 here. Say RC voted best in the nation. And then let's do 2 paragraphs of lorem ipsum text. Drop this down a little bit. So I took that article, I put in H1 for the title, and then a couple of paragraphs of text. Now I don't want to get overly confusing, but a lot of these you can use, depending on the context. So say, for example, on an article, you can have a footer. It might make sense to have a footer on the article. Maybe a little bit of text that says read more or something like that. That may be considered a footer in the context of an article. One of the interesting things about HTML is that you're sort of describing the content in the page. You're saying this is an article. Visually, so let me kind of ask you a little bit of a question here. And don't answer right away. I want you to think about it for a second. Visually, if I did not have that article tag, would the page look the exact same? Or essentially the same? It might be off by a line or something like that, but visually, so think about this. Would the page look essentially the same? Yes. So why do you think we want to have the article tag?
So you can attach it to CSS?
That's a good reason. That's one, yeah. And the other is structure. So that's good because when you have good structure, once we get into CSS, it makes it so that you're not like jumping through all kinds of ridiculous hoops. Like you can say, okay, I want all articles to look this certain way. And because you've structured it well, you have a good sense of what an article is, you know? But the other is you just want to have a well-structured page because somebody can read your code here. It's very obvious what's going on. If you just had a bunch of random paragraphs with an H1 at the top, it's not necessarily super obvious. And then the other reason is because it's better for things like SEO, for search engine optimization, because the search engines can crawl and say, oh, this is an article. This must be like a more important part of your page. This is like the main content versus like if I'm Google and I'm crawling a page, do you think the footer of the page is more important or the article? Most likely the content in the article. The footer probably just says something random like copyright or something, you know. So it sees that article and it's like, oh, okay, so what the stuff in here is probably the main content of the page. Okay, so it helps the search engines out. And screen readers too, accessibility software. But we're going to use article a fair amount, not, you know, all the time, but enough. So we've got our header, footer, article. Just from what we've seen so far, do you think article is block level or inline? Who says block level? Show hands. Who says inline? So it's block level. Most things actually tend to be block level. There's actually only a few things that are inline. Okay. And very briefly, let me just mention there's one more that we're going to use. It's called div. I don't want to talk about it yet. But div is very generic. Div just means there's some sort of content in here. It's not a header. It's not a footer. It's not an article. It's just some sort of block level tag. Why might we need that? It'll make sense once we get into those situations. Because sometimes we just need a generic container. We've already got our stuff is already inside of an article, but we just need another generic container inside that. Maybe for CSS purposes, but again, it depends on the context. So let's keep on moving along here. Let's do tables. Tables are pretty straightforward. We don't actually use them that often. There was a time on the web. Quick question. I'm going a little bit fast because this is review. Normally in class we won't get this fast, but is there anybody who needs another minute or so to copy down the source code? Okay, so let's start this EX3. There was a period of time when, in the early days of HTML before we had CSS, that people would often format their entire page, I shouldn't say format, do the layout of their entire page inside of a table. Now it probably makes sense because if you think of it, oh, well, a table has rows and columns, and that might be how I want to set up my page. But it's really not meant for that. Remember who created, so what type of profession, the guy who created the web, what did he do? He was a scientist. Scientists, the way they use tables is probably different. Imagine if you're creating let's say a simple experiment, and you've got like 10 different results. You might want to put those in a table. Think about that when you're thinking of a table, okay? Don't try to do any sort of page layout. I think we'll maybe use table like a total of 2 or 3 times in this whole course. I want you to know what it is and when to use it, but in practice, there's actually very small amounts of data that will actually fit in that. Good example of something that might use a lot of tables is maybe Wikipedia. So for example, if you're Wikipedia and you're comparing like a bunch of different car manufacturers, their sales per year, that'd probably be a good example of when to use a table. It's what we call tabular data, which is kind of a technical term, but you should get the general idea. What you don't want to do is start doing layouts for your entire page with tables. Okay, we'll learn some more sophisticated layout techniques, but we should know what a layout or what a table is. So let's go ahead and make one. So most HTML tags are very straightforward, like you saw with article and paragraphs and H1s and headers and footers. We just kind of use it. There's a couple that require a lot of structure, like they need to be used a certain way. Table is an example of that. And just, this isn't the greatest way to do this, but let's just set the border to 1. Normally we do this with CSS, but for now it's okay, I guess. Now we define our tables one row at a time. And usually we have some sort of header row at the top. So what we'll do is we'll do tr for table row. So we've defined our table. Now we're saying this is going to be the first row. And let's say, for example, people are running laps. I don't know what for, but so th stands for table header or heading. I can't remember. Let's say at the top row we're describing it. So at the top row we're going to say it's going to be which lap they're on. And then for 2 people we'll say Alice and Bob. So we've defined our table, and then remember we work one row at a time, and then within that row, these are going to be our individual, you could think of them as cells, if you kind of think of like a spreadsheet terminology. Then we create our second row. Now, do you think we use th on the second row? I see a few people saying no. So be confident about it. Why do you think, so that's the correct answer. Why do you think we wouldn't? Why do you think it doesn't make sense? Exactly, yeah. If we're defining some sort of header or heading, that would only make sense once. So just from CGS1821, does anybody remember what we use instead of th on subsequent rows? TD for table data. And so let's say this is gonna line up with lap number. So let's say this is the first lap, lap number 1. And we're gonna have a lot of nonsense examples in this class where it doesn't really matter too much what our data is, but let's just give them values. Who knows what this is? Maybe in seconds, I don't know. It doesn't really matter. By the way, notice the indentation. Hopefully you can see now why indentation is important. Because if this had all been aligned on the left-hand side, it becomes very, very difficult to see where the table rows and everything line up. But when it's indented like this, it's much easier to see. The general rule is that every time you open a tag, you indent one level. And every time you close it, you go back a level. So here we opened TR, we did some stuff inside of TR, but then because we were closing it, we went back a level. It's nice because you may not even think about it, but it gives you a visual cue that everything aligned here is inside of TR. Everything aligned here is inside the table. Everything aligned here is inside of body. Okay, so let's go ahead and preview that. You can see here lap number, and then let's go ahead and make a second lap. It doesn't really matter too much what their lap times are. So it's going to be lap number 2. Hopefully you can see why table requires special explanation, because it's not super intuitive. Most tags are, like, if you did, like, say, block quote, it's block level tag, you put a quote inside it. I mean, there's not, you can probably overthink things, but that one's pretty straightforward. Header and footer, same way. But table is different enough that you have to kind of know the structure of how a table is. Any questions on this example before we move on? Is everyone good? Can everyone see this, by the way? Is this... Okay. I should have asked that a little bit earlier in class. That's all right. By the way, at any point, let me know if you can't see, because I can adjust whatever I need to. Okay. Let's keep on going here. So next is an ordered list and unordered list. So let's go to HTML shell, copy, paste. So this will be ex4.html. So the basic difference between an ordered list and an unordered list is one has order and one doesn't. So for example, an ordered list, things that need to happen in order, like changing your car tire. You're not going to like try to, well, to take it to an extreme, you're not going to try to take the tire off while the car's still moving, right? So there's when things need to happen in a certain order, like if you're trying to make food and like the first direction is to take the food out of the wrapper and then put it in the microwave, and then you put it in the microwave without taking it out of the wrapper. You know, basic things like that. So where order matters. Unordered list is where the order doesn't particularly matter. Like say, for example, a shopping list. That's kind of my go-to, is that you've got a bunch of things. Doesn't really matter what order you put them in the cart generally. I mean, I guess if you want frozen food or something. But you get the idea. It's just whatever aisle you happen to pass it that it's most convenient, you can put it in your cart. Okay, so let's do an example. So very conveniently, ordered list is OL. And then within that, we have LI. Does anybody know what LI stands for? List item, perfect. Okay. Beautify isn't perfect. It's doing like a little bit, kind of some weird things with the indentation. I don't know a nicer way to say that. Toast the bread, maybe? It's not bread, or it's not toast until it's done. Say put bread in toaster. Toast the bread. Now it's toast, so we can remove toast. And as you can see here, by default, because it's an ordered list, it kind of implies that there's some steps to it. So it gave us this. But we can actually, with CSS, we can style this a bunch of different ways. You're not stuck with just numbers. Like you can do this in Roman numerals if you want. You can use letters. There's a lot of different ways. We're not going to talk about that right now. It's not super important. Okay. And then what do you think the tag name is for unordered list? UL, perfect. quick thing. I know sometimes I randomly talk about things. I always notice I actually noticed this, I think, last week in one of the classes. Brackets and a lot of these other editors will automatically close your tag for you. So as soon as I do angle bracket UL, close it, because then what I'll see people do is something like this. If they're staring at their keyboard, not watching the screen, and they're like, oh, okay, now I need to close it, and they end up with weird things like that. Be careful of that, okay? Just be aware that it's going to automatically close tags for you. And then same thing here. Let's say shopping list. And here you get the little visual cue that it's a unordered list. But again, don't look too deeply into some of this stuff, because a lot of this can be changed with CSS. Okay. Actually, it can be taken to the extreme. We can actually, and we may do this in this course, you can actually remove these. Because there'll be times we want to make lists, but we don't want this like necessarily a bulleted list. We're making a list, but we might want to do something on our own to where we don't even necessarily have this. Okay. A good example of when we use lists is actually in your site's navigation. So this is very common because you can kind of think of a site's navigation as a list. It's a list of links. Does that make sense? So what we do is we wrap it in this tag called nav. What do you think that's short for? Navigation. Perfect. And then from within that, we can put in an unordered list. I'm sorry, yeah. I had to think about it for a second. Yeah, we typically use unordered list because the order of the links doesn't particularly matter. And then we put list item. I'll just do maybe 2 links. This is very common. Commit this to memory because we're actually going to use this all the time. Basically, any time our site's going to have navigation, I want you to wrap it in a nav and then have an unordered list. I always check for the dropped frames. I remember there was one semester that it was like dropping like crazy, and I didn't even notice. So. Okay, any questions on this? Now, again, don't get into where you'd think, oh, I don't want the bullets, so I don't want to make it a list. It's still kind of a list. How do we get rid of the bullets with CSS? Okay, so HTML is for structure. CSS is how things look and layouts and so forth. So if it's a list, but you just don't like it with bullets, use CSS to remove bullets. Everyone's good with this example? Okay. So let's go ahead, and we have to do something a little bit different for the next thing because I want to talk about hyperlinks. So let's go to our folder that we created for today. We're going to get through a lot of examples today, but after this example, you'll have enough to do the assignment. Okay. I want to touch again on CSS, which we kind of started on a little bit last week, but I don't want to just do HTML this week. I feel like a lot of this has got to be reviewed at this point, because I think at this point most people in here have taken 2 web classes, right? Some people 3. How many people this is your 3rd class? Show of hands. How many people is this your 4th class? Anybody? Okay. What was the other class? So it's CGS1821 and
Website development.
Did-
Web design things.
okay.
And CGS1828.
Okay. Gotcha. I know sometimes it gets hard to remember all those course numbers, and
I know.
you just remember seeing the web 4 times.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and we're going to make a folder in here called links. This one gets a little bit more complicated because we're going to have like a whole structure. Okay, so let's go back to brackets. And you should see somewhere that links folder that you just created. So this might get a little bit tricky. So right-click that links folder. Let's do this. This is gonna, I don't want to throw anybody off, because otherwise it's gonna get too complicated. You know how normally we pointed it to the date? Let's actually go ahead and point it to the links folder. I don't want anybody to put things in the wrong spot. This is like seems like one of those things that you could mess up pretty easily. And then select. So I'll do that one more time. So we clicked up here, open folder, and then pointed it to that folder called links. Make sure you're inside the folder. And then select folder. I think otherwise these examples might get a little bit too difficult. Okay, so we'll do file new, and we'll call let's go ahead and paste in from our shell here. Paste. And then we're gonna change the naming a little bit. So we're going to call it index.html, which is actually much more common than our ex1, ex2, ex3. This actually has a special meaning. When you put it on a web server, it recognizes it as a special page. So just the fact that you called it index.html, the web server is going to see it as something special. I'll explain what that something is at some point, but not too concerned with it right now. And let's say you're creating a little website about yourself. So maybe you'll have an H1, it says about me. And then you've got links to the rest of your site. Now normally we might want to wrap this in a nav with an unordered list, but I guess we can. Well, let's not do it for this example. It would be the proper way, but I want to keep life simple. We'll cheat. We'll wrap it in paragraphs. Okay. Bless you. So to make a link, or like the more proper name, a hyperlink. That's the full name. Most people just call it a link, but the full name is going to be a hyperlink. We do a. So that tag is called anchor. 99.999% of the time you're going to use it for links, so you don't really have to know what it means too much. And then href, what do you think href stands for? Perfect, hyperlink reference. And then that's in the double quotes, that's going to point to where it is. We'll get back to that in a second. So if we view this page, I may have to close this and then start it up again. You can see here, IRSC is my college. We hover over it, we know it's a link. But if we click it, it's not going to really do anything. So this is the general rule, is that the text between your start and end tag, that's going to be displayed to the user. Now the problem that we're going to run into is that we can display text to the user. How do we let the web browser know where the link is? That's what we end up with this, exactly. These are called attributes, HTML attributes. And the basic idea is that it's extra information that we're passing. That extra information can be to the web browser or other thing. Like in this case, we're passing something called charset UTF-8, which is an encoding. We've seen this before when we had like style, when we were passing it some CSS. This is just extra information that we're passing, an attribute. Okay, and then let's say it's probably HTTPS. And then now it knows, okay, when they click this link, this is where you're going to go. This has all the information here. This is called a URL, Uniform Resource Locator. So it's got the protocol, which is HTTPS, which is just means that it's secure. It's got the URL. It's got everything that we need. Then we click it. It's going to take us to the IRC webpage. Okay, pretty straightforward. Let's save. Okay, so let's do this under links. And again, this is we have to be a little bit. No, actually, let's do this. We'll just do file new. Sorry, change the order that I wanted to do it. So file new, paste in HTML shell, copy, paste, and then maybe in the same folder, we've got a page called hobbies.html. And we just list our various hobbies. So we'll have an H1. Okay, you'd have a bunch of text about your hobbies. And a very, well, let's do this. So we'll just leave this page as it is. So very simple page. It's in the same folder. This folder structure is actually kind of important. So if I look inside of links, notice that I have two pages. I've got my hobbies and my index page right now. Now, if we go back to our index page and we want to be able to navigate there, we do href. What do you think I would put between the double quotes? What's that?
The URL to the hobbies page?
Yeah, and so what is that?
Hobbies.html.
Exactly. So why can't I really put like a full URL like this pointing to it?
Because it's not an actual web page, so we have a
Yeah, so we don't actually have a web server for it just yet. That's good. The general rule is that if you have a page on the same server, I'm saying server in quotes, in this case it's our own computer, but let's just pretend that our computer is a server. Well, index and hobbies are on the same server. You don't put all of this information. You could, but it makes the pages very fragile. Why might it make the pages very fragile? So let's say, for example, I'm just going to write out an example here, but don't type this because we're going to change it in a minute. Let's just pretend that there was a page on here called hobbies.html. Okay, and I was able to link to this. Well, what happens if the name of your organization changes? Not too long ago, we went from IRCC to IRSC. Well, you might think, oh, that's like a once in, a lifetime thing. That never happens. You'd be surprised how often your site actually does change. Maybe you want to reorganize your site a little bit. Maybe you don't want hobbies directly in the root of your web server. Maybe you want to put it inside of a folder and organize it a little bit. Well, if you have a couple of pages, it's not that huge, of a problem. How many pages do you think the IRSC site has? If I had to guess, maybe hundreds. And you're going in there and you're changing them all manually. So what we do instead is what's called a relative link. Relative to my current location, it's assuming on the same server, assuming in the same folder, assuming all that. Go to that hobbies.html page. This is much less fragile because I can rename the name of my web server if I want. Sometimes people will have a web server that allows you to either go to www.irc.edu or just irc.edu. This handles both cases. We can handle things like redirects without any problems. This is much more resilient. But this only works if it's on the same server. In this case, our computer, in the same folder. But when that's true, and we can use this, it's what we should use because it's going to break a lot less easy. The reason I even, it's the proper way to do it, but I have actually seen working at various organizations, I have seen people do this for every single one of their links, and then there'll be a minor change in the organization, either gets renamed or they move stuff around, or a million things can happen. And I've had to go back and actually write scripts that crawl, because once you get into a large organization, you're not going to go through manually hundreds of pages. And I would have to write scripts to go through and rename these things, and it's a giant headache. It takes a long time. But if you follow these general guidelines, it's not like strict rules, it's more like kind of guidelines, your page will be much more resilient to those kinds of problems, okay? And so let's just test this just to make sure it actually works. Make sure that everything's saved. I might have to restart the web server here. Now when I click here, it takes me to the hobbies page. Now, a very common thing is to have a link back home. So I want you to take a second here. Again, we typically wouldn't do this inside of a paragraph, but I'm just trying to save a little bit of time. Okay, fill that out. Fill line number 16 out to take me back to home. Say back to home. Okay, don't want to take too much time because it's a pretty easy problem. What do I have to put in there?
Index.
Close. Index. Perfect. So be very careful of that because modern operating systems try to hide the file extensions as much as possible, but you can't forget they're there. It's like when we're coding, they're there. It's just that the operating system many times tries to hide them. It's annoying enough that there's a setting in here I actually show them. I can't remember where it is. Doesn't matter anyway because it's on Windows. But this is very common, is that they try to hide those file extensions. But the full file name is actually index.html. We've already kind of seen that here. And then let's go ahead and test that. Sure. It's back to home, and we can go back and forth. That's the first case. That one's pretty simple. Okay, is everyone good so far? I don't want to lose anybody because this gets a little bit to be kind of a complicated example. It's like if I lose you here, then I lose you for the rest of the example. Everyone's good here. You've got your 2 pages. You've got your index page that points to hobbies. Well, we did this. This is like the one-off example. If you know the full URL, you can just link to it. But now if what we're linking to, the file is in the same folder, all we have to do is put the name. And since both of these are in the same folder, we can do that. Now what if, so let's go inside of our file manager or file explorer, and inside of our links, let's go ahead and make another folder called family. Because maybe for organizational purposes, you want to, you're doing a family tree or something and you've got like 30 different pages in there. It might get very complex very quickly. So we want to dedicate our own folder to it. So this is going to get a little bit difficult. Not too bad, but what you'll have to do is inside of brackets, right-click family and go to new file. You can't just go to file new. So make sure everyone sees that. You should see that family folder inside of brackets. Click it and go to new file. Because what that'll do is that'll create a new file inside, and then we'll just call it mom.html. Because there's a certain page structure that we're trying to accomplish here. So I've got this folder called family, and inside of it I have one page called mom. And in the folder above that, I've got hobbies and index. Does anybody need assistance or help with that? It's very important that you have that structure, because that's actually a part of your assignment. Click this. Click family here. And go to open. You might put it in the directory above it. So click this drop down, and then go to links. Click open. So you got family there. Yeah. And then now you should be able to actually click this little arrow. Did you already create mom? No. Okay. So right click family, new file, and then mom.html. You can leave the untitled. It's not going to hurt anything. And then .html. Okay, everyone's good? Okay. Oh, you need some help? Okay. So click here on the links. And go open. Okay, so click open. And then click this. So when you have all this stored, Everyone's good? Okay, so with this mom page, let's go ahead and put our HTML shellcode in here. It'll be very generic. It'll just say h1 mom. Oops. So right now we have 3 pages. We have our index page, our hobbies page, and within our family folder, we have a page called mom. So if I navigate through this, I have see I have family, and then inside of there, there's mom. Let's go back to the index page. How do I get to that mom.html file? So first of all, I can't just do mom.html. Does everyone see why? Does somebody want to try to kind of? It's not in the same folder. It's in a subfolder, but it's not in the exact same folder, so we can't do that. So what do we have to do instead? Yeah, and what's the name of that? Exactly. So first we say family, and then a /. Make sure you get these slash directions correct. Okay. On the web, we always use /. And this kind of gives you a hint. What do you think I type after that? Mom.html. Okay.
So if it was like a folder within a folder within a folder, it'd be like name /.
You just keep on going all the way. Yeah, exactly. And then watch up here. We go from index. So I click mom, and then it went into family, and then that page. Now here's the last case, and this one always throws people off. I'm in mom.html right now. What do you think I do if I want to go back home? Again, I can't just do mom.html. I can't go into a folder because it's what's called the parent directory. It's basically I'm inside this folder right now. It's like, how do I get out of here? I need to get out of here and go up 1 level. Does anybody remember how to do that? Perfect, yeah. Anytime you see ... that means go up 1 level. And then we go index.html. Now, so let me do that first, and then I want to show you some very common mistakes related to that. So we do ... /, which is the equivalent of pressing this little up button. Do they still have it anymore? Yeah. It's basically like I'm right here right now. I need to go up a level, and then there we go. Index.html. That's what that ... means. And then we can just kind of prove to ourselves it works. We can go back and forth between the pages. Now, this is a very common mistake I see, so don't do this, but I'll see people go up too many levels. What do you think the problem with this is? What happens, so let's say, for example, I've got everything inside of links. What happens if I rename links? Is this going to break everything? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you try to submit this on your assignment and then like you rename it from links to assignment 1, anytime you did this, all those pages are going to be broken. It's a very common mistake of going too many levels back. Only go as many levels as you need to, because it's like we went up 2 and then in 1, and it's just we only needed to go up 1 single level to get to that index page. Okay, be very careful of that. I think that's enough for the assignment. Any questions? We are going to do a little bit more today, maybe a half an hour more. But I think that's enough for the assignment. Okay. So let's go over the assignment here. So this is just a review. That's why you have so many different parts, just to make sure everyone, let's just say, I know there's a lot of digital media people in here, and web is not necessarily your favorite. So I try to do this one review assignment, but after this, we're going to go right into new material, okay? So it's going to be 4 parts. So the first part is pretty straightforward, and you just kind of follow the directions. It's not meant to look interesting. It's not going to have any CSS. Don't bother trying to make it look interesting because you're going to waste your time. We're going to do much more interesting things starting with assignment 2 going forward. But assignment number 1 is just to make sure that you remember how HTML works. So create a page which contains an H1, which says my demo page. Create an article within that containing the text article 1 and then a paragraph. We essentially did that in the other example. Part 2 is create an HTML page containing your class schedule. I realize some people only take like 1 or 2 courses. Try to fill it up with something, make up courses. I remember one time somebody made up a bunch of Harry Potter courses because they only have 1 course, but you know, get creative. Okay, and then there's a recipe page here. And it's just an example of using ordered lists and unordered lists. Maybe I'll make this a proper link. But the idea is that the ingredients are going to be unordered, right? Because it doesn't really matter if you lay them out on the counter. It doesn't really matter the order, really. But the actual directions for the recipe do. So you'll take this. So here we see ingredients. These would be unordered, and then the directions would be ordered. Again, it's not going to look very interesting because it's just pure HTML. Now, finally, this is the one that always throws people off because this link structure is kind of important. And I've just noticed I do this part 4, almost the exact same thing in CGS1821. And even then, everyone's still like, we spend like 2 lectures on it. Gets very confused. It's very important you know how to do this link structure. So in this case, let's say, for example, it doesn't really matter what, like you're running a business or something, and you've got multiple products. Your index page is going to be your landing page. You're going to have one folder called products, and that one folder is going to have 2 pages. Does everyone see that? If you put all of this in the same folder without having subfolders, you're going to get quite a few points off. Okay, because I always have people do this. I'm trying to be fairly obvious. It's go back to the last example we did. Okay. Now here's where I'm going to throw you off a little bit is that, and you might have to do some research. Many times you take all your images and put it in one single folder. It's just an organizational technique. You don't want all your stuff just in one folder. You want to organize it a little bit. And so I'll just make it so you just have to have one image. Call it myimage.png. Now, I do want to take a step back very quickly and just let you know there's some naming rules when you create your pages. Notice that when I named my pages, they were all lowercase and contained no spaces. Okay, that's very important. Has anybody seen on a website what happens when you have spaces? What does it turn into? Sorry, let me mute my phone. Okay, I get distracted. One more time. If I have spaces in my URL, what does that turn into? Has anybody seen a web page? I haven't seen any like this in a while. I think most people know better, but has anybody seen a web page with a lot of %20s on it? Okay, that's what happens. Is every space it looks very ugly. It's very confusing. The reason for doing lowercase is because on Windows and Mac computers, it doesn't matter. It's what's called case insensitive. It doesn't matter if you use capital letters or lowercase letters. Capital I and lowercase I are the same thing to both of those. What do people, like, what's the typical pipeline? What do people do? They develop their website on their Mac or Windows computer, and then they upload it to a server. That server many times is going to be a Linux server or some sort of other Unix server, like especially if you're paying cheap hosting fees for like $5 a month or something like that, most of the time that's going to be a Linux server. Linux is case sensitive. This is another thing I've had to write scripts for, is that people will kind of use them interchangeably, sometimes uppercase, sometimes lowercase, and you're not going to notice it when you're developing your website. But then you're going to upload it to your hosting company, and half your pages are going to be broken, and you're going to have no clue why. So if you don't want to understand what all that means, the reason I try to give you simple rules to follow is because I have enough experience in this that if you follow these rules, they're going to keep you from having giant headaches later. Okay, so all lowercase, no spaces. If you do have multi-word things on your assignment, I'm giving you the page names anyway, so you're not going to have multi-word things. But trying to think of a good example. You've probably seen this on like news sites and stuff where they'll have the title and the URL. So say, for example, we create a page that says IRC wins Aspen Award. One of the things that you want to do with your URLs is make them, they don't have to be perfectly human readable, but it's kind of nice when they are. So if you would have used spaces to make it more readable, you can use dashes. Avoid underscores. The reason being is because early on in the web, Google decided to treat underscores different than dashes. It's kind of, I don't want to get into it, it's a little bit complicated. But if you do have a multi-word page, and this is not for your assignment. I realize some of you will go off one day to make web pages and do other things. But just kind of follow those general rules and you should be okay. Everything lowercase, don't use spaces. If you were going to use spaces, use dashes instead. Makes your life much, much simpler than, making mistakes and then trying to hunt them down later, okay? Any questions? It should be pretty simple. Yeah.
Going back to the homework assignment, so like, as far as like folder organization, management and stuff, so we have CGS4828, and then we have like, so during class we have like 113, that would be our folder for examples, and today 127 have our examples. So how do you want us to do that for like homework assignments? Do you want it to be?
What I would say is probably make a folder inside of CGS4828, just call it like assignment 1 or A1.
Okay.
A lot of people do A1. And then maybe you could do part 1.html, part 2.html. Okay. Normally our pages aren't going to be multi-parts, our sites aren't going to be multi-part like this. Usually it's like you'll create like a single page and we'll work on a technique. This is actually one of the rare occasions it's actually going to be multiple files.
Okay, so A1 then is fine.
Yeah, A1's perfect. Okay. So any questions about this? Yes.
All this has to be in a zip file?
Yeah, and then so what you'll do is just for anybody who hasn't done this before. So let's say, for example, mine's called links, but say for you is A1 for assignment 1. Or let's do this. The date, 127, but instead it would be A1. So what you do is, it's similar on Mac. You right-click, and you're going to send to, on Windows it says compressed folder. On Mac, I think you don't say send to. I think if you just right-click it, it'll just, one of the listings will be compressed or zipped folder.
Compressed.
Yeah, and then once you do that, this will be the file you turn in, and it has everything all together in one thing. And I can go over that when you're ready to submit if anybody missed that. Okay, so let's do this. Let's just do a couple more examples with CSS, and then you can have a little bit of a break, and then the rest of the class will work on the assignment, okay? I'd imagine most people should be able to finish the assignment in, 30, 40 minutes or something like that, since it should be mostly review. It basically mimics all the examples that we did today, so shouldn't be out there too much. Okay, so let's do this. Let's go back to links. And let's just set it back to today. So let's set it to 127.2020. I think everyone's good on creating class, like CSS classes and stuff like that. Is everyone okay with that? And I think we went over class selectors and element selectors, correct? Does that all sound familiar? Okay. Because the one thing I do want to go over is the box model. Okay, so let's do this. Select folder. Maybe we'll just do one more example so you have a little more time in your assignment. But so we'll go. So make sure it's back to this where it lists your files, and then this will be copy and paste our HTML shell in here. Okay, so what I want to cover is the CSS Box Model. Does that name sound familiar to anybody? Okay. And typically when we're talking box model, I think the box model actually applies to inline, but almost all the time we're going to be typically talking about block level tags. That's why I made such a big deal about this earlier, is because there's like some sort of box around your content, and then at the end of the box it's a new line. Okay, so we've got our content. So anytime we create, let's say a div is a kind of our go-to. There's just some stuff in there. We're going to have the content, which in most cases is going to be the text. We're going to have some invisible padding and margin, and then a border. By default, the border is, I'm pretty sure it's 0 pixels, so you can't actually see the border, but the border we can style to where I actually can see the border. But margin and padding, that's just kind of giving extra space. So let's do this. Let's start off with a div. Oops. And then let's put in just a paragraph of lorem ipsum. Maybe a little bit this here. Go 150 without. Let's see. Make this a little bit smaller. Sorry, I'm doing this for a reason because I'm going to go inside of Chrome and it's going to be difficult to see. So I'm trying to scale the fonts and stuff. Okay, so pretty simple so far. We've got a div with lorem ipsum text. Everyone's at that point? Okay. So inside of head, remember we're going to add that's where we add our style tag. Now there's 3 different places to add CSS. There's inline. Inline, remember when we had style equals and then we had some CSS? There's internal style sheets. Right now this is an internal style sheet and there's external. I probably won't bother with external. It's very similar to an internal, except for it's in a separate file. But the problem is that when we have it a separate file, it doesn't demo very well for class because we're flipping back and forth between the two and it makes it kind of difficult. But just know that internal and external are very similar. The only difference is external, it's in a single file, and then what you can do is in multiple pages, you can say, oh, just point to that one file. Does that make sense? Okay. So here, let's say that we're going to have a div. Now, there are 3 different types of what are known as selectors. There's element, class, and ID. This is an element selector. How do we know it's an element selector? What's that? So not so much the brackets. Let me give you. So if I wanted to create a class called like announcement, what do we put at the beginning when it's a class? We put the dot, correct? And then if it was an ID, what would we do? Does anyone remember? The number sign? Okay. The giveaway, A, there's no character in front of it, and then B, it's the name of a tag. Okay. And what this does is for every div, it applies to it. The reason I'm doing this is because we only have one div, so it doesn't really matter. Okay. Did that make it too blurry for anybody? Okay. So let's do this. Let's give it a background color so we can see what we're working with. Something light. Alice blue, I guess, is fine. Or I wonder if there's something like a light red that we can work with. Which one? White what?
Oh, light.
Light. Coral. Perfect. Okay. And remember how these work. These are called key value pairs. So this is the CSS property. The property is called background color, and its value is light coral. So this right now it has an invisible border. So let's do the first thing. Let's actually view the border. So we'll say border is going to be 1 pixel solid. Green should show up pretty well on that. So we're adding multiple properties to this rule. So you can see that this is the content. 1 pixel was too small. Let's say 8 pixels. What's that?
I did like 7, but I couldn't see it.
Yeah. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So this is the border, and this tiny little bit of area between the content and the border, that's going to be our padding, and then that little bit of area between either the edge of our page or other block level tags, that's going to be our margin. Now, the reason that we're seeing this, we didn't specify any margin, is because by default, our page actually has some margin. There's a bunch of ways to actually reset those defaults. There's all kinds of CSS out there. There's one called like reset.css. There's a bunch of them. And they'll actually reset it back to like normal defaults rather than the Tim Berners-Lee 1989 defaults. Now, when we're inside of brackets, brackets isn't very good at working with Chrome's developer tools. So I'm going to take a little sidestep here, and I'm going to open this up in Chrome. And the reason that I wanted to make this larger, close this out, there we go. This is actually the box model right here. This is pretty cool because anytime you need to see on your page what's going on, so I hover over this, notice that it highlights the content. I hover over this, it highlights the padding. Essentially there's no padding, so I hover over this, it highlights the border, and I highlight over this, or I hover over this and it highlights the margin. What do you think the margin is? I don't know if you can see it very well, but it has little 8s around here. Means that it's 8 pixels on the margin. That's just the default margin I happen to get for the page. So let's go ahead and add some additional margin, 25 pixels. Should be pretty obvious what's going on here. Here's our margin. If I refresh it in here. Oh, maybe I didn't save. Let's try this again. It's weird. It's not reflecting here. I'll just stick within here. You can see here we've got our margin. Same thing with padding. Do maybe 15 pixels padding. You can see here we've got a lot of padding. So the box model seems pretty straightforward so far, hopefully. We've got a content, the border, and then the padding and the margin. Now, a very common thing to do is to have a fixed width block level tag. So in this case, a fixed width div. So what I might do is say that the width is 150 pixels. The way the content normally flows is that with a block level tag, it's going to try to take up as much of the page as possible. In this case, it's going to go as wide as possible. But because we set the width, it's only going to take up 150 pixels. Now let me ask you a question that's maybe not super obvious. If I put another, say, paragraph, any sort of block level tag in here, is it going to be, where's it going to put it? Is it going to put it here on the right, or is it going to put it below it? Below it, right? Just because the definition of a block level tag, what happens at the end of a block level tag? Jumps to the next line. Okay. Let's do this. I think I've done as much as we reasonably can with this example. I want to do one more minor thing, but I don't want to mess this example up. So this is going to be the one time we can copy and paste code. So let's do edit, select all, or Control A or Command A, whichever you prefer. I actually prefer Control A, but just in case anybody doesn't like using shortcuts, you can do edit, select all, and then copy. So new, paste it in, save it as ex6.html. So it's literally just the example we did, but I didn't want to mess that example up. I just want to modify it a little bit to show you something. So this seems like kind of an obvious question, but when we didn't have the fixed width and it tried to span the full width of the page, let's say, for example, let me go back to EX5. Or no, I'm sorry. We already set the fixed width. So when it wasn't fixed width, it tried to take up as much of the width as possible. So I'm just going to modify this. We'll change it back. You don't bother changing yours, but I'm going to get rid of the width. And because it's no longer fixed width, notice that it's taking up as much as it can. Now what happens if I resize the width? It reflows, and my page might look a little bit different. So you might ask yourself, when is this going to happen? This is actually very common, is if somebody's saying viewing a page on a smartphone versus a TV versus a monitor, any sort of screen resolution or screen size differences, people are going to see a slightly different version of your page. Well, this is, from a design point of view, this can be a problem, because think about if you're doing, you're laying out a magazine or newspaper. It seems kind of silly to even say this, but the magazine and newspaper, it's not like each person's going to have a different size newspaper. Everyone's going to get the exact same newspaper size, The web is different because everyone has different size monitors and different resolutions and different size devices, so people are potentially viewing your site in different ways. Now this is a kind of a minor example, but imagine you've got a full web page and you've got navigation, you've got a lot of content, you've got a header, footer, all that sort of stuff. You don't necessarily know how the page is going to look at a million different resolutions. Okay, so let's do this. Let me add back the width. Does it change as I have different device widths?
No.
No, it stays the exact same. In the early days of the web, designers discovered that they could use this. And what they realized is, rather than having a site that's very unpredictable, like you don't know the resolution that it's going to look like, or else you're testing it on different, million different resolutions. A very common technique was to say, well, what I can do instead is I can have a fixed width page, a fixed width div. We'll do this, I guess, next week. Have a fixed width div, put my content inside that, and then no matter how wide or narrow the device, it's always going to look the same. Now this worked okay in the 90s and the early 2000s because back then, think about the different monitor sizes. Like it ranged from 15, 17, 19, the range of monitor sizes that you might view a site on were very, very small. So it might be the difference of somebody arriving at your site with this width versus this width. Not really terribly huge differences. What's the ranges of screens that somebody might view a website on today or web page today? From the largest TV all the way to the smallest phone. So this technique isn't as useful as it once was, but we still can use it, but not for our whole site. What we'll do as we go forward is that we'll use it for little pieces of our site, and then we can have the content reflow in different ways. We'll talk about that as we go on. But this idea of a fixed width div, this is actually very, very, very useful. Even today. You might not make your whole entire site one big fixed width div. You might make little portions of the content and then have it reflow as we get to smaller devices, but it's still extremely useful. Now, one of the things that we could do with this is that if you wanted to center the content, and I'll show you an example of a page, is that what we do is on example 6, rather than setting, let's get rid of this margin here, what we can do is we can, because it's a fixed width, we can set the margin to auto, and then what it'll do is try to space out the margin on the left and right hand side. What's the effect? What's the end result? It's going to be centered. And then so you can see here the content is always centered relative to the web browser, and you can see here it's not reflowing any text. Now I'll give you an example of this. So the IRC site for years used this technique, and we just recently updated it. But there's kind of some references to the old IRC site, I think, still out there. I think it's Smart Catalog or something like that. Yeah. So what they would do is this whole thing right here is a big fixed width div. And then notice, and then what they would do is some sort of solid background color to kind of fill up some space. What happens if I have slightly different monitor resolutions? I just see less blue. So this is a very popular technique for the longest time, but obviously with mobile, this is no longer practical. It's been a very long time since I've had to do this, but does anybody remember on older sites where you'd have to kind of pinch zoom on your phone? It's been a while, but that's actually how you would have to handle sites like this, is that you would have to actually like pinch and zoom around on the site. But most modern sites are mobile friendly. You've got to, it actually, Google will rank you lower in the search results if it detects that you're not a mobile friendly site. So that's why you're seeing fewer and fewer of those sites, because I think people realize it's like, oh, nobody's ever going to visit my site if you can't view it on mobile. So, but in certain organizations, like what they call enterprise sites and stuff like that, where I know everybody in that organization is going to be, say, filling out their timesheets. You might have created a web app for filling out timesheets. I know everybody's going to fill it out on their laptop or whatever. You can still use techniques like that. But anyway, we'll talk about that more. It's not a completely useless technique. It's just you can't use it for your whole page anymore. You'd have to use it for smaller parts, like maybe just say like a side navigation or something like that. Or we'll learn lots of layout techniques, but I just wanted to touch on that. I think that's it. So I know we talked about some CSS, but just to let you know, this assignment does not require any CSS. It's not going to look very interesting at all. This is just like, do you still remember how to write HTML? Okay, everyone good with that? Okay, so let's do this. I'm going to stop recording. Oh, I hope it didn't mess up the stream when I changed size. I don't think it did. I guess we'll find out.